Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Alright, let's go. Preemptive like. I'm done being scared here. Look, I've been to YouTube copyright re-education school. I'm a good boy now, okay? Gotta push forward. Preemptive like. Battle of Isis. Alexander the Great, 333 BC. Kings and Generals. Original link to the video, top of the description. Right below that, link to the Discord. Click on it. Love to have you. I'd recommend watching the previous 3 parts, but that is up to you. Or ask to copy someone's notes. Pay attention. Phones away.
In our previous episode on the conquests of Alexander the Great, we covered how, after his first victory at the Granicus River, the king successfully besieged the cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus, consolidating his hold on Western Asia Minor in the process. As Alexander was doing that, the Persian King of Kings, Darius, was readying a royal Persian army to come and confront him. Now the ascendant Macedonian war machine was set to advance east, and the harnessed Persian juggernaut was coming west. The only possible result was a clash of titans. So join us once again as we cover the first of the truly grand-scale battles in Alexander's War of Conquest, the Battle of Issus. Alexander found himself in many hairy situations because of his rashness, but our advice is to avoid any situations where hair can be problematic, and the sponsor of this video, Manscaped, is here to help you with.
Guys, make sure to use the Manscaped/Kings. It helps them out. Please do that.
This. For us, Christmas came early this year because we were gifted the new Performance Package by Manscaped. Let's see what's inside. Manscaped created the world's first all-in-one men's grooming kit that has you covered from head to toe. The Lawnmower 4.0 waterproof cordless trimmer is built with advanced skin-safe technology, which helps reduce nicks and cuts on your most sensitive areas. Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant and the Crop Reviver Ball Toner Spray are game changers. New to the collection is the Weed Whacker Nose and Ear Hair Trimmer. Don't deny it, deep down you know that you need them. The Weed Whacker has these 360-degree rotary blades and the skin-safe technology to prevent tugging and tears in your nose and ears. Manscaped is no longer just for below-the-waist grooming. In addition to products for your face, they now have you covered head to toe with their new and improved Shears 2.0 luxury 6-piece stainless steel nail kit. Every guy out there needs to add Manscaped to their wishlist this season. Don't wait, click our exclusive link in the description to get 20% off, plus free international shipping, plus 2 free gifts.
Let's do it!
Once affairs at Halicarnassus had been settled, Alexander divided the army in 2. Parmenion marched off to the north with orders to secure the inland territories of Asia Minor between Sardis and Gordium, while Alexander took the rest on an eastward march along the coast. Moving into Lycia as 334 passed into 333, the Macedonians subdued and received the surrender of over 30 towns, including Telmessos, Xanthus, and Phaselis. Following a brief spat with some Pisidian Hillfort brigands, who reportedly burned their own families to death rather than have them fall into Macedonian hands, Alexander passed into Phrygia and swiftly reached the linchpin town of Kelene. As it possessed a nigh impregnable acropolis, Alexander was forced to accept the defenders' terms that if no relief arrived within a certain period, they would surrender. After personally waiting 10 days, the king decided to move on. To conclude matters at Kelene, Alexander appointed a relatively obscure old guard officer to serve as satrap of Phrygia and assigned him 1,500 men to deal with any resistance. This aging, grizzled, but unassuming general would, in the course of 3 decades, rocket from a mere governorship in Phrygia to almost winning the entire empire Alexander was in the process of creating. He was Antigonus the One-Eyed. From Kelene, Alexander marched north to Gordium, the ancient royal seat of the mythological Phrygian monarch Midas. Here, he cut or somehow otherwise undid the Gordian
Cheater.
Knot, an act that traditionally dictated Alexander was destined to become ruler of all Asia. Fortunate events elsewhere were to grant further credence to this newfound destiny. After his dogged, albeit failed, defense of Halicarnassus, Memnon
Sparta, League of Corinth, Epirus, Macedonia. So, he is a Macedon king, and he's fighting off the Persians. So these aren't any threat to him, right? The other three Greek kingdoms right
of
now.
Rhodes had finally been granted the Great King's green light
Memnon.
to carry out the strategy he'd proposed before the Granicus, scorched earth and a second front.
I gotta say these names like Memnon and Mehmed, cool.
Darius also funneled his favorite Greek general plenty of treasure, with which he energetically recruited another professional mercenary army and saw to the maintenance of his 300 to 400 ship fleet. With this powerful seaborne force at his disposal, Memnon launched an assault on the Aegean islands. Kos and Samos came over to the Persians, followed by Chios and even the great port Mytilene on Lesbos. Meanwhile, the Rhodians' agents and spies went through Greece, priming the always rebellious city-states to revolt against Alexander when the time was right. In strategic command, Memnon seems to have truly been in his element. All of a sudden, a Persian counter-invasion of Greece looked entirely possible, and Alexander's overextension into Asia Minor seemed foolish at best. However, at this moment of greatest danger and Memnon's highest point, the Rhodian general suddenly fell ill and died in summer 333. Alexander, who received the news at Ankara in May or June, was elated. The indirect second front plan was Memnon's own, and without its mastermind, the endeavor completely collapsed.
Wow.
Macedon was safe.
That much rested on one guy.
Without its mastermind, the endeavor completely collapsed. Macedon was safe. When the disastrous news reached
Guys,
Susa,
question, but like, how much do you think a person is of a difference to a horse? Like what? Like I wonder how much harder it is. Obviously, they're big animals and strong, and very capable of carrying people. But I just wonder how much harder is it to carry a person than to just like run on its own? Weird question.
When the disastrous news reached Susa, Darius III called together a conclave of senior advisors and allies to establish what exactly was to be done. The majority of these Persian counselors advised Darius to confront Alexander now, in person. The troops would fight better with their great king alongside them. One of the detractors, a fervently anti-Macedonian Athenian mercenary commander exiled by Alexander, known as Charidemus, hotly argued that it was sheer stupidity to risk the empire on such a gamble. An experienced general, such as himself, he argued, somewhat self-servingly, ought to be sent to conduct the war. Darius agreed at first, but the throng of Persian advisors balked at the idea and shouted it down.
So is Rage what? Is that where modern-day Tehran is?
But the throng of Persian advisors balked at the idea and shouted it down, even accusing the Greek of wanting to betray them to Alexander. Fiery-tempered Charidemus shot back, raving about the Persian lack of fighting will and manliness. His tirade so offended Darius that the king subsequently had Charidemus executed.
What?
From Susa, therefore, the great king marched to Babylon, gathered his many vassals from across the empire, and summoned their armies. Meanwhile, at Ankara, Alexander received the altogether insincere submission of the provinces of Cappadocia and Paphlagonia before marching southeast to the Cilician Gates, which was held by a small force of Arsames' troops. However, in a stroke of luck Alexander would later recount as his greatest, Arsames
What was that land thing?
of the province. While at Ankara, Alexander received the altogether insincere submission of the provinces of Cappadocia and Paphlagonia before marching southeast to.
So he did that on purpose in order to like get them less organized for Darius?
The Cilician Gates, which was held by a small force of Arsames' troops. However, in a stroke of luck Alexander would later recount as his greatest, Arsames and most of his men were busy burning and ruining the Cilician plain in accordance to Memnon's scorched earth strategy, allowing Alexander to seize the mountain pass in a night attack.
So that's what Alexander calls himself. This is what he calls his greatest stroke of luck when they were just burning stuff.
Realizing what had just happened, Arsames fled to rendezvous with the king, and Alexander entered Tarsus on September 3rd, 333.
Wow.
After jumping into a freezing river, the king was left debilitated.
According to Plutarch and Aristobulus, after a long march, Alexander was taking a bath in a cold river, which was called Sindus. He fell ill, possibly from hypothermia, but later saved by his physician Philip.
By a bout of illness for several weeks. During this time, he sent Parmenion around the Gulf of Alexandretta to scout out the situation and hold the crucial passes between Syria, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. In the course of this mission, Parmenion established a base of operations at a small town called Issus, and established that a massive Persian army was occupying Soki beyond the Syrian gates. Once Alexander recovered, he marched the entire army around the Gulf. Perhaps acting on misinformation, the king left his wounded at Issus before continuing south and arriving opposite the Syrian gates, where he expected Darius to come from. He didn't, preparing for his coming stroke by sending his baggage to Damascus. Instead, employing what in hindsight was a brilliant strategic maneuver, the Persian royal army, accompanied by Darius's wife, mother, and children, as was Persian custom, circled around and took a long route through the northern Ammanic Gate, descending on Issus from the north. Every wounded Macedonian soldier found there had his hand severed, and Alexander was now cut off. Initially not believing
Guys, I'm assuming having your hand severed, especially by a invading army, would just be a death sentence from either blood loss or infection, right? I mean, why even bother cut their, maybe to suffer, I don't know.
The Persians were behind him, Alexander sent a galley up the coast to establish the truth. When the vessel returned with confirmation that Darius was indeed at hand, the king immediately grasped the severity of the situation and gathered the unit commanders. He gave a speech, first emphasizing how superior in the arts of war they were than the enemy, and then of the advantages to be gained. While the Persians occupied a position on the Issus plain in the late afternoon, near a river known as Pinarus, Alexander, who was about a dozen miles south, fed the bulk of his army a hot meal in preparation for the coming march. At the same time, the king sent mounted scouts to scope out the road between the Macedonian army and its destination. When night fell, Alexander marched his whole army to the high ground at a pass known as the Pillar of Jonah, from where he could see the Achaemenid campfires glimmering across the plain. The well-fed soldiery now also got the rest and recuperation it required, sleeping for many hours. Just before daybreak, the army rose from its slumber and began a disciplined march up the narrow coastal road. Although confined to columns at first due to the terrain, with infantry units in front and cavalry behind, more Macedonian warriors were gradually brought forward as the terrain opened up, slotting seamlessly into the formation. When Darius received word that Alexander was closing in, contrary to his expectations, he sent a force of skirmishers and most of the cavalry to ford the Pinarus, aiming to prevent the Macedonians interrupting or even seeing his deployment. It was probably around this time that Alexander arrived opposite the stream with his infantry regiments lined up with the sea on his left and foothills to the right. The majority of Alexander's cavalry now massed on the right flank, and all of a sudden, the long-awaited showdown was now imminent. It is incredibly difficult to establish exactly how many soldiers Darius III had with him at Issus in 333, a fact that makes charting the course of the battle that much harder. Typically hyperbolic ancient sources, such as Arrian and Plutarch, estimate Persian strength as anywhere from 250,000 all the way to 600,000,
Jesus.
Numbers which are clearly excessive. Modern arguments favoring the other extreme state that Darius's army was no larger than Alexander's, at between 40 and 60,000. For our purposes, we will estimate that the Persian army at Issus was around 100,000 strong, outnumbering Alexander 2 to 1. King of Kings Darius III, manning the royal chariot, was stationed front and center. Surrounding his immediate person were the infamous Persian immortals, the royal bodyguard, whose number never dropped below 10,000. Off to either flank were 10,000 Greek mercenaries, and further still were units of mixed Persian infantry, known as kadekis, fronted by archers. The second line was made up entirely of lightly equipped levies. Now that the infantry was arrayed, Darius brought his myriad cavalry back across the Pinarus. Our sources tell us of Medes and Hyrcanians, but we can infer the presence of Paphlagonians, Cappadocians, Cilicians, Bactrians, Sogdians, and even steppe nomads from beyond the frontier, massing on the flatter seaward side of the battlefield. Another small Persian unit was sent to occupy the hills behind Darius's extreme left flank, to threaten the Macedonian right flank and rear. As with his infantry deployment at the Granicus a year earlier, Alexander's main battle line Sarissa phalanx was divided into 6 brigades. They were led, from left to right, by officers Amyntas, Ptolemy, Meleager, Craterus, Perdiccas, and Coenus. To the left of the standard phalanx were Cretan archers and Thracian javelinmen, while to the right were the elite Hypaspists under Nicanor. They were flanked to the right by the Macedonian king and his customary strike force, companion cavalry under Philotas, Paeonian light horse, Agrianes, and archers, supplemented by the Thessalian division. His army was still about 4.
I know I'm a bit late on this, and I should have said it, but it just came back to me. So the reason they're called the Immortals is because they would always make sure to, like, if 1,000 died, you'd put 1,000 back in. Like, no matter what, their strength would be at 10,000, and so they almost seem like a invincible, unkillable force. It's a really good idea if you can get the word out of the reputation
40,000
or of the idea.
strong in total. Both forces now prepared for the clash to come, but Alexander saw 2 matters of concern that required attention. First and foremost was the overwhelming concentration of devastating Achaemenid cavalry opposing Parmenion on the left. If the order of battle stayed as it was, Darius's horse would simply sweep his army off the field. To remedy this, the king swiftly adjusted his plan, sending the Thessalians across the battlefield to reinforce his second-in-command as covertly as possible. Second, but still troublesome, were the Persian ambushers positioned in the hills. Alexander dealt with them by detaching a force of Agrianes and light cavalry, and sending them to secure the heights while the main battle went ahead. However, the pinpoint accuracy of the slingers comprising part of this raiding force succeeded in dislodging the enemy so quickly that its bulk was able to rejoin
That's cool. So they were, I mean, what were they slinging, rocks or?
the main line of battle. Just 300 cavalry were seconded to keep an eye on the skittish enemy. With his concerns dealt with, Alexander ordered a slow, measured, and deliberate advance to begin across his entire line, periodically halting in order to bait Darius into
I gotta pee quick, guys. Be right back. Okay, I wash my hands.
deliberate advance to begin across his entire line, periodically halting in order to bait Darius into attacking first. The Persian king did not fall for it, instead keeping his line solidly behind the Pinarus. At last, when the armies were about to enter missile range, Alexander rode from one end of his line to the other, shouting words of encouragement to the highest officers and the lowliest footmen alike by name. He told the Macedonians of their valor and Philip, the Greeks of the injuries Persia had inflicted upon them in centuries past, and the loot-oriented Thracians of the booty that was waiting just for them. According to Rufus, as the great king then galloped back to his position at the head of his right wing, the Persian front raised a great cry of battle, which was then returned by the Macedonians with equal vigor. Then, almost simultaneously, both Darius's massed cavalry on the seaward flank and Alexander's strike force on the other side of the field, together with the central Macedonian phalanx, launched their attempted hammer blows. It was now a question of time. Parmenions' Thessalian and allied cavalry was beleaguered and outnumbered, and would eventually collapse. But would that crunch point come before Alexander could win the battle? the warrior king of Macedon charged directly across the Pinarus at the head of his picked force of companions and others, delivering a critical strike to the units opposing him almost immediately. The Xyston-wielding cavalry wedge first smashed into the screen of Achaemenid archers, killing many and driving the rest back into the infantry behind them. Without slowing for a moment, Alexander barreled on and smashed through the first infantry line as well, utterly collapsing Darius's left wing. Unfortunately for the king, the battle elsewhere was taking a bad turn. Parmenian's gallant horsemen were essentially surrounded by the Persian cavalry and fighting a losing battle, but that was to be expected. More disconcerting was the situation in the center of the battlefield. Perhaps drawn in the wake of their king's charge, some of the rightward phalanx regiments and hypaspists had drifted yet further to the right, opening up a gap in the line. This, combined with the rough terrain near the stream, diminished the integrity of the wall of Macedonian Sarissa. Before the Phalangites could regroup on the far bank and reorder their formation, Darius's highly trained Greek mercenary contingent, 1,000 strong and armed with shorter spears that were better suited to such uneven ground, came to grips with them. What ensued was a brutal slogging match, Macedonian soldiers fighting tooth and nail to best their Greek enemies amid the steep, bramble-overgrown bank of the Pinarus. The inflexible phalanx's inexorable advance proved itself exorable indeed. Noticing the newly opened gulf between the Macedonian infantry units, a force of Greek mercenaries attempted to drive into it and break the invaders' phalanx apart. All of a sudden, the Phalangites began withdrawing. The situation might have turned especially sour if not for the prudent intervention of Ptolemy, son of Seleucus, accompanied by veterans and officers who fought to keep the line steady and plug the gap. 120 of them lost their lives in this ferocious melee, together with Ptolemy himself. Still, the momentum in the center was with the Persians. Fresh from his relatively simple task of rolling up Darius's left wing, Alexander got as good a look as he could at the state of the...
Look, I'm well aware of how far Alexander the Great goes, and so he clearly wins this battle. And he seems to be losing everywhere but with his personal, battalion legion here, so let's see.
The battlefield and quickly decided what to do next. Pivoting inward from the now exposed Persian left, the companions swung around and charged the flank and rear of the Greek mercenaries in the center. This assault relieved a significant amount of pressure on the Macedonian phalanx, allowing it to regain formation and continue advancing across the river. The momentum had now shifted the other way. Now, either by accident or on purpose, Alexander and his elites found themselves tantalizingly close to Darius's position. The king laid eyes on the Persian great...
Does he die here, Darius?
King, and with Homeric spirit launched an all-out attack, intent on seizing Darius and ending the war. Observing the danger, Darius's dutiful brother Oxathres led the royal cavalry bodyguard into Alexander's path, who, despite fighting doggedly, were promptly slaughtered. In the desperate struggle, one source relates how Darius even managed to wound Alexander in the leg before being carried into danger by the spooked horses of his royal chariot. A second vehicle was quickly brought up, allowing the king to flee the battlefield. Seeing the...
You gotta think, I'd imagine when you're in the midst of battle, I'd imagine the horse has a very difficult time distinguishing, a enemy from a fellow, from a Persian soldier. And so, yeah, I'd imagine if the horse gets spooked, kind of like with the Hannibal, those elephants, they'd get spooked and stuff. Wouldn't really know where to run.
Departure of their near-deific monarch and the collapse of their infantry, the Persian cavalry assailing Parmenion fell apart and routed, along with the rest of the army. Arrian's account of the battle, on the other hand, differs significantly. In his version, once Alexander had routed the Persian ambushers stationed on his side of the river, he slowly advanced his army to the river. As soon as he came within missile range of the Persians, the Macedonian king initiated the battle, charging across the river with his companions to minimize casualties from the arrow fire. This detachment crashed into the Persian left flank, forcing them to give ground. In the center, however, the Persian force was pushing back the Macedonian phalanx as it attempted to scale the banks of the river, and Greek mercenaries were also attacking the phalanx's right flank, left exposed due to Alexander's charge. More importantly, the Persian right had charged Parmenian's wing once the phalanx was engaged, and was pushing back the Thessalians placed against them. This, then, was the moment of crisis. The Macedonian center and left needed to hold long enough for Alexander to rout the Persian left and swing back to be the hammer on the anvil. Fortunately, Alexander's initial charge had been devastating, and the Persian left soon crumbled. Quickly he gathered his force together once again and rode to the rescue of the phalanx, hitting the Persian center in the flank and rear. It was at this point that Darius, seeing his left flank destroyed and his center near surrounded, fled the battle.
But his brother died, I thought. So, how does this version of events account for his brother dying in that charge on Alexander?
Persian right flank, though having been rather successful in their fight against Parmenian's flank, saw that the battle was now lost and pulled back, initiating a general rout. By all accounts, the Battle of Issus was over by early evening. But Alexander wasn't close to finished yet. To destroy the Persian king's army wasn't enough. He wanted Darius. So while the Macedonian soldiery set about killing Persian stragglers and looting the great king's staggeringly lavish camp, the victorious monarch began chasing Darius, who was about half a mile ahead of his cavalry. Only 25 miles later, when darkness finally fell, did Alexander return. And
I love how they call these things gates, like the valleys in between two bigger mountains.
25 miles later, when darkness finally fell, did Alexander return empty-handed, Darius having escaped across the mountains. In the meantime, the triumphant Macedonian army had been dividing the spoils of victory in the Persian camp. This included vast quantities of gold, silver, fine clothes, jewelry, and as a consequence of Persian custom, all of the royal women who had accompanied their King of Kings to the battlefield. The less noteworthy of these captives were treated incredibly poorly by the soldiery. There are myriad stories about what Alexander did when he returned. These include Alexander's care and reverence towards Darius's immediate family, and the king's good humor when Darius's mother mistook the king's friend and likely lover Hephaestion for Alexander. But the most telling is related by Plutarch. Upon returning from pursuit, Alexander came to the royal tent, which had been prepared for him by pages, overflowing as it was with luxurious furniture, beautiful servants, and treasures beyond count. Walking further into the magnificent property at the fore of his closest companions, Alexander saw the great golden bath of the king, the basins and pitchers and tubs and caskets, all of gold and curiously wrought. Although a royal and used to comfort, the Macedonians would have almost certainly never seen anything like this, let alone owned it. So after surveying his prodigious new wealth,
I want to learn how the Persians got to this point.
Alexander turned to his friends and said the words, "This, as it would seem, is to be a king." These post-battle anecdotes are particularly illustrative to us. Arrian writes how he cannot but admire Alexander for treating the royal women with such respect, and being battle anecdotes are particularly illustrative to us. Arrian writes how he cannot but admire Alexander for treating the royal women with such respect and being magnanimous in victory, thereby highlighting the king's admirable personality. But this initial taste of oriental luxury and Alexander's reaction to it foreshadows the near despot that he would eventually become, believing he was to be worshipped like a god. But
so this is when he starts to go, this is the victory where he starts to believe, hey, it looks like I could become really rich.
For now, Alexander had won the Battle of Issus in emphatic.
Guys, he's got to be the richest guy in history, right? Alexander the Great. Some people say Mansa Musa, but all I can figure out when you look up the guy is that he had a lot of money. And it's like, why is this guy the richest guy in history? Or, you know, maybe he was just best at advertising his wealth or whatnot. But if Alexander technically owned everything in his empire and he controlled the Persian Empire, then I'd imagine it'd be pretty hard to beat that personal wealth.
Fashion. With it, Alexander had won the Battle of Issus in emphatic fashion. With it, the western half of the Achaemenid Empire was now open for conquest. In the next episode, we will talk about the Siege of Tyre. If you want to catch that video, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely.
Tyr is next. How he became the pharaoh. Gaugamela. Alright guys, cool. I'm more awake now. Had my coffee. Hope you're all doing well. Learned something or can teach me something. And I'll be back with the next episode soon. See you guys.